The conference is part of an effort to revitalize political economy, and I would say the social sciences more generally. If you get a program on the back, we have a description that we call New Interrogations of what it is that we're trying to do. Videos of many of the presentations at these conferences are available online, and I've noted the URLs for those. I also encourage anyone who is interested in engaging with theories of capital, this effort to revitalize political economy, to go to the Critical Mass Forum board for any questions or discussions. There are programs available over by the entrance. We just want to note that Saturday and Sunday have a slightly different format. We're calling them workshops. And the purpose is to have less of the standard conference Q&A style discussion and more of a engaged discussion. So they are single paper panels, although the duration of the presentations will be the same. My name is Troy. I'm one of the student organizers of the conference. If you have any questions, you can ask me or David and James, who are sitting at the front. For participants, for those presenting, we ask if you are willing to be videotaped to please sign a video consent form. Before any video is made public, we will contact you once again to get your consent on the content. Also, for anyone staying at Kiel, we are arranging taxis to take you to Glendon, which is where the Saturday and Sunday workshops are taking place, and there's a sign-up sheet for the taxis at the front. So if you're staying at Keogh, please go and add your name to the sign-up sheet. Any participants who are being reimbursed for travel or accommodation costs, please come and talk to me, and we will make arrangements for that reimbursement. And finally, if we can ask that everyone turn off their cell phones or at least put them onto vibrate, that would be much appreciated. Okay, thank you. I look forward to a great conference.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Jordan, and I'm going to be chairing the first panel. We're going to have 25-minute presentations, and I've told each speaker that I'll be relatively authoritarian when it comes to keeping the time. Our first speaker is P.F.Doran. He's at the School of Law at Queen's University in Belfast, and his research centers on the development of the political economy of attention, and he also builds in Buddhist social policy as a way of sort of pushing this research program forward. Our second presenter is Dan Bousfield, and he's at the University of Western Ontario, and he looks at the political economy of protests. Peter, if you'd like to.
Thanks. Okay. Just to begin, and by way of setting the scene, I'm going to introduce some of the ideas on a presentation, and I'm going to include a clip from a film which contains some choice language, so forgive me at this early hour of the day for exposing you to that. The context is a scene in the film, Detachment, and the teacher in the public school is addressing the students in the context of some bullying that has taken place. I'll just proceed with this for 5 minutes, and then I'll address some points in the paper itself. So these images are some of the latest technology that will be used by companies who want to track attention and monetize their capacity to manipulate and manage attention for website readership. You can see the technology being worn by the subject and the way in which the gaze is tracked, and they can track the exact location or residency of the gaze using the goggles being worn by the subject. Just a little bit of background. One of the first people, possibly the first person to explicitly coin this language of the attention economy was Professor Herbert Simon. And he wrote back in, I think it was the 70s, in an age of abundant information, it is important to be able to persuade others to notice your activities, and so attention becomes the important currency of exchange. And what information consumes is rather obvious. It consumes the attention of its recipients. And really the background to this paper is the acceleration of that truth, if you like, in the context of an information-saturated world.
To take something in.
Okay, excellent.
So just to give you a bit of context, in the movie Detachment, substitute teacher Henry Barth drifts from school to school, classroom to classroom, and during a one-month assignment in a failing public school, he finds a connection to the students and teachers who are all, in their own ways, experiencing a deep loss of connection and negotiating a world so bereft of love and attention that they have become, in a way, invisible at home and in the workplace. Screenwriter and former public school teacher Carl Lund has his teacher, the character in the film, deliver this speech in his classroom during a pivotal moment in the film. And as I say, the language is quite choice because he's warning the students in a way about some bullying, but really it's a bigger observation about the society that the school is trying to service. Whoops.
To absorb. Anyone?
Everywhere, all the time.
So what is ubiquitous assimilation?
Always absorbing everything, everywhere, all the time.
Well done, George. How are you to imagine anything if the images are always provided for you? Who here read 1984 last year? Good. Anyone? Meredith?
Having two opposing beliefs at once and believing that both are true.
Excellent, Meredith.
Why do you always suck his dick, you fucking kiss ass?
To deliberately believe in lies while knowing they're false. Examples of this in everyday life. Oh, I need to be pretty to be happy. I need surgery to be pretty. I need to be thin, famous, fashionable. Our young men today are being told that women are whores, bitches, things to be screwed, beaten, shit on, and shamed. This is a marketing holocaust. 24 hours a day, for the rest of our lives, the powers that be are hard at work, dumbing us to death. So, to defend ourselves and fight against assimilating this dullness into our thought processes, we must learn to read, to stimulate our own imaginations, to cultivate our own consciousness, our own belief systems. We all need these skills to defend, to preserve our own minds.
Okay, so that's a dramatization in an attempt to draw out where many of us live, in a sense, you know, insofar as we're immersed in some of the technologies, and at the end of the treatment of the media. Now, that's a comment on the public realm. Another interesting development, of course, is the dramatic rise in the interest in the practices of mindfulness, or attention, virtue, the virtue of attention, drawn from Buddhist practice, but now framed more and more within secular practices as well, in the context of the treatment of depression, the treatment of other pathologies associated with what we call the social recession, that are outcomes from hyper-consumerism. So the other side of the paper is an attempt to introduce some insights, not just practical counter tactics, if you like, but insights from the philosophies and informing knowledges that lie behind mindfulness. And three of the major concepts from Buddhist practice in particular are interdependence, a notion that that reality is fundamentally interdependent. It doesn't begin with discrete entities. The second one is attentive virtuosity, this cultivation of mindfulness, and then moral clarity arising from those insights. So I'm just going to pick out some sections from the paper now, just to go into a bit more detail, having set the scene. Chris Hedges also summed up where we live today in the recent commentary. He said, our corporate culture has effectively severed us from human imagination. Our electronic devices intrude deeper and deeper into spaces that were once reserved for solitude, reflection, and privacy. Our airwaves are filled with the tawdry and the absurd. Our systems of education and communication scorn the disciplines that allow us to see. We celebrate prosaic vocational skills and the ridiculous requirements of standardized tests. We have tossed those who think, including many teachers of the humanities, into a wilderness where they cannot find employment, remuneration, or a voice. We follow the blind over the cliff. We make war on ourselves. The nature of modern mass mediatized capitalism poses a direct threat to well-being at the most subtle levels of human experience, that is, attention and intention. In so doing, a fertile ground is being prepared for a popular denial of the world's ecological predicament as well as its social predicaments. And innate faculties for personal and collective resilience are being undermined. Now, in the words of the Chan Buddhist, Chan is the Chinese equivalent of Zen, the Zen tradition in Japan. In the words of Peter Hershock, through the consumption of mass media as well as other commodities, attention is exported out of our immediate situation. This compromises relational depth and quality, effectively eroding presently obtaining patterns of mutual support and contribution, and triggers further and still more extensive commodity consumption. As this recursive process intensified beyond the point at which all major subsistence needs have been commodified, consciousness itself is effectively colonized. The relational capabilities of both persons and communities atrophy. Situational diversity is converted into mere circumstantial variety. And the very resources needed to meaningfully respond to and resolve our suffering or troubles are systematically depleted. As I have mentioned, at the same time, the West, and America in particular, has witnessed an explosion of interest in Buddhist-derived teachings on mindfulness or meditation. Now, most of the popular literature on mindfulness adapts these ancient teachings for a secular audience in search of enhanced states of individual well-being and personal resilience at home and the workplace. Indeed, a number of America's largest corporations now regularly host mindfulness seminars and training for their employees. This growing interest in mindfulness takes place against the backdrop of, and is in part a response to, an unprecedented intensification in the targeting of attention by a complex of dominant capitalist actors responsible for our immersion in a culture of consumerism. The sociologist Zygmunt Bauman described the society of consumers as one that interpolates its members primarily as consumers. It is a society associated with a consumerist syndrome of cognitive and evaluating predispositions. And for Tim Jackson, who has written for the UK Sustainable Development Commission on consumption and prosperity in the context of the transition to a sustainable economy, Jackson said that these predispositions associated with consumerism are associated with what he describes as a social recession, including rising rates of anxiety and clinical depression, increased levels of addiction, and a decline in morale at work, with clear implications for the emerging debate on the problematic relationship between prosperity and notions of well-being. As advanced global capitalism targets, perhaps above all else, the human capacity for attention, there are far-reaching implications for our well-being, psychologically, physically, and spiritually, and ultimately for our global ecology, because our innate capacity for mindfulness and a quality of attention is the realm, or the final commons, if you like, where the potential for human adaptation to new ecological and social boundaries must be cultivated if we are to flourish as a species in the era of the Anthropocene. A little bit about the background to this immersive culture around consumerism. With the decisive shift in the balance of public and private control over the global media and telecommunications complex that commenced during the 1980s, the processes of capitalization targeting attention formed the vanguard of capitalism's psychic investment, a form or forms of technology designed to enclose the human imagination and notions of subjectivity. And notably, that dimension that Foucault talks about, that relation to the self. As Jonathan Rutherford has noted, the fastest growing economic sector during the 1990s was the culture industries. Advertising, architecture, TV and radio, music, publishing, film and video design, designer fashion, and computer and video games. Their raw materials are information, sounds, words, symbols, images, ideas, produced in creative, emotional, and intellectual labor. But they also rely on newly conceived and scarce resource, that is attention. This late capitalism or new capitalism is extending commodification into the realms of subjective life. Its forms of production are not confined to output, but use individuals and their relationships in the co-inventing of cultural and symbolic meanings and new ideas. To quote Rutherford, the market creates communities of interests and seeks the intimacy of the consumer in order to embed commercial transactions in personal and daily life. Promotional culture creates desiring consumers whose personal histories can be mined for their interests, desires, and purchases. The economic sphere expands as production conscripts the thinking, imagination, and sensibility of individuals. So a significant chapter in the backstory to the rise of the attention economy is the radical restructuring of global media ownership and regulation during the neoliberal era, accompanied by parallel developments in the telecommunications industry in support of the expansion of transnational capital, which has resulted in new patterns of concentration of ownership and investment. Just a little bit about the mechanisms. Nicholas Rowe, drawing on Foucauldian scholarship, has done some work that allows us to, I think, describe the connection between capitalization and the psychological processes that have captivated media audiences. Rose's work on psychology, power, and personhood provides a useful theoretical departure point for what he calls a genealogy of subjectification. To write such a genealogy is to seek to unpick the ways in which the self functions as a regulatory ideal in many aspects of our contemporary forms of life, including our systems of consumption. The subject of consumption is the individual who is imagined and acted upon by the imperative to consume. Rose writes, a genealogy of subjectification takes this individualized, interiorized, totalized, and psychologized understanding of what it is to be human as the site of a historical problem, not as the basis for a historical narrative. And this genealogical work, as I've noted, follows Foucault's interest in our relation to ourselves. It is a genealogy of a being's relation to itself and the technical forms that this has assumed, according to Rose. Quoting again, our relation with ourselves, that is to say, has assumed the form it has because it has been the object of a whole variety of more or less rationalized schemes which have sought to shape our ways of understanding and enacting our existence as human beings in the name of certain objectives. Indeed, branches of the psychological sciences have facilitated the translation of important features of the capitalist complex, notably objects of capitalization, in a way that they become psychological, and that they're problematized or rendered simultaneously troubling and intelligible in terms that are infused by psychology. Just a couple of last comments. As has been noted, the Friedmanite individual may feel free to choose a location in the distribution of circuits of production and consumption, but the distribution itself is shaped by the power institutions and organizations of capitalism. And it is this shaping, the very multifaceted creation of a predictable representative consumer, that gets capitalized. Tim Luke comments that under corporate capitalism, the plannable life course of all individuals, qua consumers, becomes a capital asset in that the consumative mobilization of production directly boosts the productivity, profitability, and power of corporate capital's increasingly automated industries. Thank you very much.
Okay, my presentation isn't nearly as pretty as the last one, but I don't trust technology as much, even though I'm actively presenting on it today. So today I'm going to be talking about my starting point for this is a report that came out in 2011, late 2011, from InfoDev, one of the World Bank's mini think tanks on online stuff. And it said that there's more benefit for developing countries to shift towards the virtual economy than traditional industries. So it looked at, and it did this just basically to make it look sexy so that people would read it. Said that if you look at the difference between virtual economy and coffee production in developed countries, the virtual economy in 2010 was estimated to be about $3 billion. Most of it stayed in the developing countries where it happened. Estimates are there's about 100,000 virtual economic workers in Southeast Asia, and they're shifting around. And so that money stayed in the developing countries. Whereas in coffee production, a $70 billion industry, only $5 billion of that stayed in the economies where it was produced. So the bulk of it was moving abroad. So from this assumption, they said the virtual economies are a good thing, and we should look at how we can use them as a development strategy or how it will benefit the economy. So they look at three things in particular, and I'm going to talk about these three things today. The first is gold farming, and this goes up and down. The idea behind this is that massive multiplayer online games require in-game resources, so they have to have things like gold to buy things to move forward and to work over time. So they labor, or they fight, or they steal gold in order to get new things in the virtual world. And as a result of this, there's a third-party gaming service industry, TPGSI, or tertiary markets which develop in Southeast Asia, which do nothing but farm this gold. They literally go online, they play however they have to play in order to get resources that they then turn around and sell to players in the developed countries. So that's the main one. The second one is Microwork, and these are the increasing tailorization and transformation of working practices that are taking place in developed countries and shooting them off to developing countries. So things like one of the fantasies of this is that you waste so much time in your day checking your email. So why can't you just farm that out to a developing country? So somebody does that for you and sorts your email and then sends it back to you immediately. So Amazon Turkey is one of the big places where this happens. They create little yes or no questions, little tiny, they compartmentalize every part of a problem and ship it out, and then people in mainly India and increasingly Africa do these little tasks and get paid for it. And then the third is cherry blossoming, and this is paid social networking. So because of the ubiquitous of social networking now, likes are valuable. And the more likes that your company has, the better off you can be. Facebook just purged about 1% of all corporate likes that were seen to be fake or farmed in the last couple days. So a bunch of sites have lost a bunch of their likes, upwards of, I think a couple of sites lost 100,000 likes. Because this is what's happening, is that companies are paid in order to cherry blossom. So this was also what Mitt Romney got in trouble for early on in the campaign, was that all of a sudden his Twitter following went from 50,000 to 150,000 overnight because of this cherry blossoming. So you're basically paid social networking, user-based advertisement, network promotion, paid spectators. So increasingly it makes more sense to have these people work in developing countries and do the kind of leisure work of developed countries, liking things. So the creation of kind of fake online profiles in order to do this. So in the context of this conference and of capitalist power, I'm looking at the qualitative practices of accumulation. In most cases here, I'm assuming the corporation, in the case of a virtual world, fully creates and occupies that world. It literally has a world that it exists for nothing but to generate profits, to generate some type of future income stream in which it can say to investors, look at us, we have, in the case of World of Warcraft in 2010, we have 12 million users who are paying us a monthly fee, and that's the foundation of our accumulation. The more that we get, the better off we are. Now it's dropped since then, and I'll hopefully get to talk a bit about why that is. So what I want to do then, and I was introduced and I said this as the political economies of protest is normally what I do, but I wanted to think about the qualities of power, and then we can start to think about what it means to have resistance in a fully commoditized space like the online virtual world. And resistance doesn't have to be good things, it could be bad resistance, as I'll talk about. The possibility of virtual ethnic cleansing is what we'll see is the case when these workers are targeted in the virtual world. So accumulation decisions in the virtual world produce consequences for these tertiary markets. So things that happen in the virtual world have a direct result. If we do get on board with the World Bank that this is a good development strategy, things that happen online then impact more and more the developing world. So on top of this, though, the more interesting for me in terms of thinking about the power of the corporation is to think about how the corporation increasingly adopts the role of the state online. So decisions, in particular end user license agreements, the things you never read on iTunes when you click accept to install them, become the foundation of rules by which these tertiary markets develop and exist. And changes in the end user license agreement changes the developing investments here. They change how the world functions. So a part of this then is to develop a social re-embedding through the virtual world to conceptualize how the corporate power actually, if it is adopting the role of the state, is generative of resistance and generative of social powers. So it's a way of thinking about the corporation differently in the context of this broader capitalist power. So The primary focus has been World of Warcraft. This is, again, it tends to be Western-based scholarship on this because World of Warcraft's relatively easy to find. I asked students in my class how many people play World of Warcraft, and you could talk to them about it. But most massive multiplayer online games have been struggling with this tension between these two different income streams, these two different ways of conceptualizing what the virtual world should be. One model of the virtual world is subscription-based, like World of Warcraft. It's basically an addiction model. And what it says is that if we can get these people hooked on it, they will continue to give us an income stream over a long period of time. The problem is that we've seen this with World of Warcraft, especially in the last 2 years, we get burnout. People burn out and they don't participate anymore. So there's problems with it. It's very labor intensive. So to develop your gold, you have to be online 24 hours a day. You've got to do as much as you can to get ahead. As a result, subscription-based models tend to spawn these tertiary markets where you have a separate market that exists to sell and buy products that are created in the game. Now, in order to address this, and this has been debated, and this is where they're shifting, they want to shift, even in World of Warcraft, to in-game purchases. So actually, you don't have a subscription, but instead the virtual world has real market transactions, so you have to pay for the goods in the virtual world, but you don't have to pay to get in. So the idea is you can bring a broader base of people into your income stream, and you can have the development. This also limits the tertiary market because it brings it into the virtual economy. So you actually, in this model, they're trying to undermine this development strategy promoted by the World Bank. It internalizes tertiary markets. And so all of these corporations, Activision, Blizzard, Vivendi, are all part of the World of Warcraft. They want to maintain a social world, a virtual social world, and social markets to sustain income and growth. They have to actually create a virtual social world if they want to see income streams in the future. So the corporation is then tasked with developing socialities, nice places for people to go online so that they will take their money and inject them into these virtual markets. And so what we see then is increasingly these virtual constitutions. So we have to have decisions like, is the reselling of goods allowed within the game? And if it is, who is allowed to resell them and how are they allowed to do it? Is it permissible to transfer your CD key? So you're done with your game, can you transfer it to somebody else? Can you transfer your online identity to somebody else? Who decides these things? Increasingly, the real world courts are involved in these decisions. And so what you have, when you do develop in-game purchases in these in-game markets, you have things like this happen, where EVE Online had a Ponzi scheme emerge in these virtual markets. You have currency collapses, which happened to Bitcoin last year, which is a virtual means of exchange. So you start seeing in the fully commoditized virtual world things that replicate what happens in our real economies, whatever that means. And so theorizing then this, coming to terms with this then, is this the way I go about it, is try to understand the socially embedded character of these economies. How do we understand the politics of the virtual economy, political economy of the virtual economy? And so these income streams are dependent then on the maintenance of these social worlds, these virtual worlds online. And so this kind of exemplifies, and I think this exemplifies this move towards what capitalist power is as the corporation trying to extend its reach in order to get all these streams, but also at the same time without the traditional restraints. They get to create the world. The only limit to the income stream is what they can think of and how they can bring in mechanisms to do this. So the theory I draw upon then in thinking about the social capitalist virtual world is feminist IPE and the ideas of social reproduction, in part because women's labor is often virtual labor, in that it is not part of the regular economy, it is not commoditized, it's not considered valued in the market sense. And so as a result of this then, you can see how all of the broader social reproduction, so you get all of these market metaphors emerging in the virtual world. Well, we have to do it this way because it's the most efficient way of doing it. We've got all of the same production of insecurity that we see in the real economies we see in the virtual economies. So people who are gold farming are more susceptible to attack, to banning. They become very insecure because of this model of economic development in the virtual world. And so the virtual economies then have to create virtual value. And the value has to be marketized and monetized, but the value itself exists in the social, the creation of the social world. So it's a social re-embedding of even the capitalist-created virtual market, the virtual economy. And so this is what I'm trying to get towards, is a social re-embedding of the notion of the virtual economy. And so social reproduction then in the traditional feminist IPE sense is the situating and understanding creation and maintenance of communities, because that's what the virtual economy is, the ability to have these resources available and use them over time. And so in the language of capitalist power, then it's kind of like a creorder without restraint. It's a creation and an order that exists only to the extent that the corporation can get enough resources in to build that world. And so in the traditional, the kind of feminist sense, this is gender, the reproduction of the species, the devalued practices of women is transferred over into the labor power as commodified as capitalism. And so I'm trying to get a sense of this in the virtual world too, because we see this happening, especially with these virtual markets. So we have to understand then capital as situated in these communities. So what is acceptable in the virtual world to turn into marketized, and what the virtual world itself, the members of that social community say is not permissible. And I've got some examples of this later on, where the people online start organizing against the excessive marketization. And the easiest way to do that is just to leave the game. But increasingly that's the nuclear option, which the corporation doesn't want. So we see then how neoliberalism in the traditional move from the public to the private to the virtual to the monetized follows very similarly the virtual market. So we have to create a social space online, and then we have to figure out how to monetize it appropriately and also keep our costs down by whatever we can do. So there's this reproductive element inherent in the virtual world that mirrors the kind of discussions that have taken place in feminist IPE around this. And the central one, again, is the virtual world is great for this, because the fictitiousness of commodities is exactly what the virtual world wants. They want whatever is being consumed and whatever is being traded and whatever is on the market to be nothing but a fictitious creation. So if we go back to this notion and this Polanyi's notion of labor is only another name for human activity at life itself, produced not for sale but for entirely different reasons that can be detached and monetized. Land is only another name for nature, which is produced by man. Money is a figure of purchasing power. And rule is the mechanism of banking or state finance. None of them is produced for sale. They're turned into these fictitious commodities. So the argument here is that we know, Polanyi argues, the economy is already fictitious, right? It's already virtual. And I think that fits well with the capitalist power framework and the ability to manipulate through sabotage or investment the income streams of future growth. And so I like the idea of re-embedding the virtual economy because it's a correctness. Part of the reason that the virtual economy is sexy is because it's new. And new is assumed to be better and revolutionary and prevent all these things. All the data on the virtual economy is guesstimates. Because it is functioning in a space that cannot be accessed. It's functioning, these 100,000 workers throughout Southeast Asia are not able to access. So at the best, this development strategy for the developed world is based on guesstimates. And so that's why I think the qualitative understanding is important here to understand what is happening in these spaces where labor is taking place, but we can't see it, much like we understand gendered labor in the past. And so there are revolutionary potentials in the moments for the social world to reimagine what it's supposed to be doing. And the idea of producing virtual economies as a development strategy, they use the language, this is revolutionary, we haven't thought of this before, but in fact it looks very much like it did in the past. Virtual creativity only works as long as people are willing to participate in it, and the industry itself has to creatively sabotage the elements of non-commodified space. It has to pull in as much as it can. And so the reorganization of labor into the industry of this model of the virtual economy between the virtual world and the real world looks a lot like traditional models. We have Southeast Asia doing all the labor, and the developed countries are the ones producing and consuming the goods. So for it to be new, we're not really seeing these things that are different. You still see traditional pushing around of comparative advantage in labor price shortages. There is this rumor that Indonesia picked up a lot of slack in gold farming during Chinese New Year, and then it got resituated in Indonesia because nobody was doing gold farming, there was a shortage. So it shifted to another low-cost area almost instantly because nobody was doing it, and then they continue to do it because they have access. So you still see things happening very much like in the past. And so as an innovative industry, as something new, there's a lot to be questioned here. The practices of laboring itself raises questions about what it means to labor, because the difference here between gaming and work is virtually indistinguishable. The person who is gold farming in a developed countries in their room at home farming, and the person doing it in Southeast Asia are virtually identical. It's just that one decides they are going to sell their labor and one doesn't. One is gaming and one is play. And this goes back and forth. And so power leveling is just the idea that you get somebody else or you do it yourself to move up the levels of rank in the game. Rather than you do it, you just pay somebody else to do it, or you buy their character so you get up. So increasingly, people who have to power level have specialized skills in Southeast Asia, the same skills that you would have if you do it yourself, you just pay them to do it. So it's a transformation of labor and work and play all at the same time. And so the model of subjectivity then looks like this. We've got virtual labor happening at home, and then when it goes abroad, all of a sudden it's productive labor. So the stuff that's happening in the developed world isn't counted, and it's developing world, well, you should adopt this as your economic model because this is the way to things. So there's an indistinguishable subjectivity here between developed countries playing and developing work, and it reproduces this same thing. Yep, okay. So I've talked about that. As a market for growth then, the report does not examine any of these things. States, lawyers, end-user license agreements, law. None of these things are part of this because they look at it from an economic view. So politicizing it, we have to question what this is. One, they can't monopolize this industry, so it literally can shift everywhere. It has a high degree of virtual instability in it. And also the gaming industry itself. The rise of microgaming and the collapse, if you look at some of the recent, like Zynga, has been the shift to try and find a good income stream model, and it's literally been chaotic. So to tell countries in the South that this is what they should be doing for development increases their likelihood of instability, insecurity, and vulnerability. So the markets then is used as this constant metaphor for why it's good for developing countries when in fact it's much more complicated than that. So market instability is still a central part of these here. There's this constant state of rescaling. Every new game that comes out, then all of those people have to learn the new game in order to get access to these resources. It involves long hours in basically, they set them up in the equivalent of, internet cafes. And so anybody can set them up. That's why they say it's good, because it's cheap to set up, but it's very long hours, and there's all of these barriers that exist within it. That's Mechanical Turk, I won't talk about that. On top of this then is this reproduction of Microwork. If you've ever done a CAPTCHA, have you ever done these to get online? The idea behind them is that you should be able to get, that's you doing Microwork in and of itself, because Google uses those to help improve its image recognition software. So you are microworking for them for free. They want the developed countries to do this full time. And so this is the penetration of these markets into all aspects of daily life. They've been targeting women in the developing world in refugee camps to do microwork, like for Amazon Turk, in order to give them a little bit of income per day. So this becomes the new strategy. Samasource is one of these. So your business, save your business time while your money is doing work. Give these minute tasks. They set up a station in a refugee camp, and these women can turn their labor into virtual money and virtual economy. And so this is promoted by Google, and everybody else is saying that this is a good thing to go. I do want to talk just a bit here about the regulation. The idea then with cherry blossoming and end-user license agreements is that the value of these secondary markets is contingent on whatever happens, whatever decisions are made by the corporation itself. So you have to have the right amount of state regulation and the right amount of corporate regulation. So China went and was moving towards banning gold farming, but then that means you decimate this economy. But if you're too lenient and you allow too much piracy, well, then you undermine the market itself. So there's this strange tension between the two. as the corporation has to regulate, there have been questions about who is liable for in-game actions. Who is liable for the loss of property? The Korean courts ruled that property created online through chance was not considered real property, but property created through labor online was real property. You have legal rights to it, so you can't be banned away from your own property. Okay? And so increasingly the courts have to come in and decide these questions because the corporation itself can't. It can't decide the difference between goods of value and goods of chance. And the idea here is that the courts actually said that the violation of the end user license agreements doesn't undermine ownership itself. So the properties being created in the virtual world have legal foundation because of their laboring nature. And so increasingly then, if we want to talk about what these mean, the transformation of corporate power in the virtual world makes the corporation responsible for policing, sustaining, and maintaining these income streams. So they have to create a society in order to do so. And the virtual economy is then within the corporation itself, and it cannot be marketized into an income stream in the same way that others can. And this is why in the abstract I call it parasitic, because these markets have to exist on the edge of the end user license agreement, and they can't, the corporation itself can't make a decision. It has to decide between the subscription model and the in-game purchases, and each of those result in erosions as a result. And so the virtual social values then, such as nogold.org, say, in a massive multiplayer online game, from Party Poker to Farmville, relies on a sense of currency and a sense of economy. But if you bring a load of currency that was farmed in a way that was unnatural to the world, or generate money from stolen items, or selling them, the economy declines in health. All of these are socially, the social markets embed in order to bring this up. Now the question comes, what kind of societies does that create? This was a slaughter of gold farmers online because the communities generate massive resistance to these practices, and they did it to sell their other websites. So they slaughtered a bunch of gold farmers, laid out the bodies in World of Warcraft in order to advertise their own site. So they become the targets then of social contestation. The idea here is that that because these social values exist, the corporation then has to decide, are those practices allowed and not allowed, and what kind of society we are creating there. So the idea is just a couple implications from that. The idea here of having the corporation completely create these societies makes us think about, can we think about the corporation as socially regenerative? Does it create the spaces for developing new socialities and new types of politics, virtual ethnic cleansing? And also that the values and prices created even in the virtual world remain embedded in a social context. And so these markets have the same reactions that regular markets do, even though they're virtual. So the corporation represents a social form of value. And that social resistance then can force these actors. So when they have to respond to these ethnic cleansings, the corporation then, Blizzard then takes on the role of the state. I have to decide these actors are responsible and these are not. These guys are going to be punished, these are not, because of what happens in the virtual world. Okay, I think that's it.
Thank you for those two presentations. Perhaps it makes sense to field the questions in waves of 3. So can I detach this microphone here and walk it around, or do you want to just, you got one? Excellent. Okay, so I'll take questions. Maybe we can go 3 at a time and direct them to the presenters. Sean?
Thank you very much for 2 very interesting presentations. I have a question and comments for P.F.Doran. It's absolutely fascinating how capitalism has co-opted Buddhist principles of mindfulness and simplicity, and how we need to overcome craving and desire and so on. So General Mills is one of the corporations that's at the forefront of this. So they have meditation rooms in their headquarters and in their subsidiaries where they encourage workers to meditate every morning in circles and so on. And of course, we hear about all these Buddhist billionaires. So Steve Jobs was the most famous. 1974, he went on his 6-month ashram hopping trip in India. And in one interview I read, he claimed to incorporate Buddhist or Zen principles of simplicity in his design and in the iPhone and iPod and so on. And you know, Apple is, of course, one of the most consumerist corporations possible. I mean, they create products that are not very different from the previous one every year to you know, so you got to keep buying a new iPhone, et cetera, even when technical reviews are not as good as others. So despite all this co-optation and so on, and we can go on and on, do you think that Buddhist principles of mindfulness and simplicity and so on could form the basis for anti-capitalist resistance?
Do we have a second question?
I'm wondering if Dan can talk a little bit more about who exactly, if it's known, is working as these gold farmers. Where are they coming from? Are they? It's not working. Are they relatively poor? Are they coming from the middle class? Because it would seem to have some fairly high costs to enter into this world, and I'm wondering what the sort of relative wages are to working in a more traditional sweatshop.
Okay. All right. If there's no other questions, maybe we can get a response. Then, oh, sorry, there is one more question. Do you want to, James, deliver the microphone?
Yeah, sorry, just checking it's on.
For Dan, I do sometimes read the end user agreements on this, and in as much as corporations are considered to be people in law, they're psychopaths, in my opinion. And so my question is, do you feel any moral compunction to tell the truth when you say, I agree to this? I don't. Do you?
Okay. So maybe we can get the responses perhaps in order. Makes sense?
Sure. We do it from here or at the...
I think you both have microphones on.
You can hear, can you?
So you could do it from there.
Yeah. It's a constant tension in this area, because clearly mindfulness is ripe for being co-opted in just the same way that yoga and other forms of ascesis can be presented, and in some ways genuinely presented as ways that complement the desire to improve productivity. And in the realm of psychology, it's really these are adaptive practices. So you're adapting to the social context rather than enhancing your ability to critique it. Now, my intention really, my main intention today was to present the possibility that Buddhism and the philosophies underlying mindfulness, including teachings around the self, do bring quite a sophisticated psychological and philosophical set of insights into the pathologies that result from consumerism. And this is really my point of entry into this debate. I began with an interest in the tensions between consumerism and citizenship, but I also have this interest in the tensions around, the claims that consumption is linked to happiness and well-being. You're aware of that debate that's emerging, no? And clearly, the Buddhist social teachings have very interesting things to say around the more sustainable, less materialistic forms of rewarding life and well-being. And they also provide us with a deep sensitization to the forms of psychology and the complicity of forms of psychology with the co-emergence of capitalism. The figure, I suppose, just a final comment, the figure who represents that relationship best of all maybe is Edward Bernays, who is the nephew of Freud, who imported Freudian insights into the design of his public relations and advertising industry. And I think Buddhist psychology, sophisticated Buddhist psychology stands in opposition to that kind of instrumentalized psychology. Thanks.
Hey, Dan?
On the issue of gold farmers, yeah, I didn't get to go into it as much here, but there's a lot on it. There's documentaries on the gold farmers. Generally, they tend to be males. They tend to be in their, the 17 to 22. They burn out really quickly. There's a lot of isolation. There's a lot of harassment that they deal with in the virtual world. So it's very demoralizing. Wages tend to be better on the whole, but the costs actually are quite low. One of the things that the original study that this one was based off of did, and it's an extensive study that was done in the UK, saw that the costs were relatively low because you lease out all the computers, you just need a space to set them up, and then you have the people come in and do all the farming. So, so it's relatively easy to set up because computers are accessible and all you need is an internet access. So that's why they can pop up and disappear quite quickly as well. But it tends to be grueling work, and there's been quite a bit about this, the relationship of what should the developed gamers' relationship be to gold farmers when they encounter them online. There's kind of this standoff now, you just kind of leave them alone because they're doing their job. But you get all of these same social dynamics you get with any type of migrant worker who comes in, and all of the same kind of ethnic and racial problems that emerge between different groups. As for the end user license agreements, I like to think of them as constitutions because they're constituting the world, so they're up to legal challenges. And the problem with the virtual economy is that the real world recognizes the property and the values created online. So and this happens all over again, so Blizzard will fight somebody contesting their end user license agreement because they have, the case famously was a stolen CD key. Do I have the right to my avatar that I created online, which has a lot of value in it, all the labor that I put into it, even though that CD key was stolen? And the courts have said, yes, the values that are created online, though you've put labor into them, they count as real things. So the end user license agreement cannot override those values. So it sets up the world, it establishes the world, but it can't adjudicate between social contestation. It functions as rules, but in the case of the entire third-party gaming industry, it's illegal. All end-user license agreements say you cannot do this. And so you have the IMF saying, do this, right? So the politicization by the advocates of this industry violate the very terms of the industry itself, right? Don't listen to it. Go ahead and do this because you're getting more wealth from doing this than you would from coffee farming, right? So I like to think of it as that.
Interesting. Are there other questions? We can do another round. So James?
Hi, this is a question. Hello? This is a question for Dan, and I guess it's a question and a comment, but I'll do the question first so I don't kind of lose it at the end of the comment. So for games where there is almost kind of a strictly kind of embedded market. Oh, my apologies. Sorry about that. My question is for embedded, so for embedded economies or embedded markets strictly in games, where you are, in a sense, buying items directly from the owner of that game. So you go in the game, your character goes to a market, and they're selling a sword, and it actually says you can buy it for 200 gold, or you can buy it for $3.99 with your credit card. Right. So my question is, do they have any justifications or theories of how they actually price those items? So when they say that this sword costs $3.99, is there any sort of justification or kind of explanation saying, oh, well, we do this because the amount of labor that needs to be put in, the amount of time that is required to find this sword? Now the comment that I have is that recently Valve Software, the owners of Half-Life 2, Team Fortress, actually now hired Yanis Varoufakis as their economist in residence. And funny enough, when he was actually hired, the reason that he was actually chosen was because the Valve Software in an email described that they have a problem similar to the problem of Germany and Greece, where they need to actually merge two markets together, and they thought that Yanis would be someone that could actually help with this. Also of interesting note, he actually now has a blog on their website where he kind of updates it, and he actually makes the claim that finally, now looking at virtual economies, we actually can find price equilibrium, because we can actually look at these games and we can actually look at the way that the prices fluctuate, And if there's any quote-unquote externalities, well, you can actually design the game to get rid of those, to get rid of these problems, to kind of streamline it, to almost have, I guess what he's claiming, a market that will be able to actually reveal the true values of these items.
Okay, so that's one question. There's a microphone here if you'd like to take that.
Yeah, I guess my question's for Ed as well. Since I'm actually heavily influenced by the gaming industry with my two younger brothers who drag me there every weekend, I think. Actually, the interesting thing I think with the gaming industry is I don't know if you know about League of Legends or Riot. It's a totally free game to go play online. The interesting thing is how much that company who actually sells their games for free is actually worth. They recently just sold their company, I do believe, to a Chinese video game company for $1 billion. Now, their profit stream comes from two things. One, advertisement. So you go onto YouTube and you see the amount of skilled players who sell their skills by just giving them for free on YouTube. Oh, stop here, sorry. Yeah, so there's that one profit stream, and Riot makes a profit out of that for allowing them to post, the property rights on YouTube, right? And the other income stream is just from actually players developing skins for the champions. And that's interesting too, right? Because you have dedicated fans who would love to get their artwork on this video game, and Riot gets it for free because they submit it under like contests, and then they sell it for about I think $15, $20 per skin. And actually, League of Legends and World of Warcraft had this big fight online, who had more users. And League of Legends is actually pounding the crap out of World of Warcraft now. I think it's upwards of 18, 20 million worldwide. Anyway, that's just interesting.
So maybe one last question, and then we can go again to.
Dan, just a challenge to your pessimism in terms of the World Bank report. I don't even know. Might be loud. So I just a little challenge to you. You seemed a bit. You seem somewhat assured that this is not necessarily a productive option for people in the developing world in entering into some of these virtual economies. However, I see it in a very different way because the empirical data suggests that over the past 20 years, we've seen a profound growth in sex tourism in the developing world, and it's been facilitated through the internet. And when I think about social reproduction of gender, I look at what's going on there in terms of the actual use of the woman's body or the child's body or the violence done to a body, all in the frame of this kind of, psychology of power that's in there. And there's been a very strong effort being made by Interpol, by the US, by its partners in several legal organizations throughout the world to prohibit this practice. And when I think about the way you presented things, I don't get that reality of how there is a policing mechanism out there looking to prevent people who are at the most marginal places within our global political economy from basically virtualizing their exploitation on a very visceral level. That's quite different from this concept of avatars and all these mediated kind of images and symbolic narratives that are constructed through video games, which are very male in their orientation. They're very visual logic, and if you want, I'm not going to get into that, but I'm just kind of interested in why I saw nothing about sex tourism in either of your presentations when basically it's a significant problem when it comes to the way in which when I saw that first YouTube video, the first thing that came to my mind when that teacher was saying, why is it we're having such a negative view of women and relationships and all of these things that are happening? And I look at the subjectivity of people in the developing world who have a chance to gain capital from this type of work. So I would like to hear a little bit more about that.
Could we just get one more question? Jung Chul actually had his hand up as well, and then maybe we could go to responses. Just a reminder to everyone else, for the duration of the conference, we need you to speak into the microphone so that the recording will actually pick it up. We can all hear each other's voices just fine, but the recording might not pick it up otherwise.
I'm happy to meet somebody who's trying to reframe political economy based on the new perspective of Buddhism, because this is what I'm doing for the past years. I think the Buddhist teaching is far more than the idea of mindfulness, of criticism of consumerism. Also, I found that some Western critical thinkers already adopt the Buddhist teaching. For example, Nietzsche and many postmodernists criticize the idea of the subject. The main teaching of the Buddhism is that there is no subject, such a subject that can be constitutionally endured from the beginning of the life and at the end of the life. So it means that it is a teaching of emptiness. This teaching of emptiness also already adopted by many postmodernists, and they use this idea to criticize the idea of modern state, the idea of representation. So already, I mean, that social science already has some kind of Buddhist teaching to reframe the Western social science. So my question is how to adopt this already adopted social science in Western academy and to the poly economy, and my question: what are you thinking about this already exist this tradition that developed in the Western social science to reframe more developed poly economy?
Okay, thank you. So maybe we can take that in order again.
Oh, sorry.
Whoever.
It doesn't matter.
Right. Doesn't really matter.
The reason that I did try to suggest that we're looking beyond the focus on mindfulness and attention. That clearly is one of the central practices. But there are other teachings, and it goes back to the first question again. Teachings around the nature of the self, i.e. there is no self. I think when we go beyond, when we respond to that first question about the way mindfulness can be co-opted, for example, the part of the response to that is, yes, of course, if it's simply about reinforcing a Western or traditional notion of self, but clearly Buddhist teachings take us beyond that, and that's part of going beyond the possibility of being co-opted, because as I say, those teachings are quite subversive of some Western psychological notions of self that reinforce the self, for example. Okay. And I think my approach is not simply to cite Buddhist social theory per se, but to try to look at the way it has influenced key continental philosophers, including people like Foucault. Foucault spent time at a Zen monastery and engaged in the practices of a Zen monk, and talked about the way in which some of the philosophical underpinnings of Buddhist teaching would be extremely valuable once they began to inform philosophical conversation in the West. So that and as you say, people like Heidegger and Nietzsche have also been influenced. I think that's a fascinating part of the discussion, the way in which postmodernism, especially some of those writers, post-structuralists, are influenced already by similar ideas to Buddhism. But the big gap in postmodern and Western inquiry is practice. Buddhism has never dropped the very strong connection between what we know and the pursuit of knowledge and insight with practice, work on ourselves, ascesis. And I think that's the most interesting contribution that Buddhist social inquiry brings, because you could never read real Buddhist scholarship without the challenge of actually linking your social analysis with how you work on this, on your experience of self and body, for example. And Foucault made a very interesting observation around that. You know, he did a lot of excavation around ascesis, of course, in the Western tradition, and pointed out that there were times in the Western tradition as well, where what we know, that our knowledge was always staked on who we are in relationship to the knowledge and the self. You know? So I think that's the interesting contribution to be made. It's not just the parallels in the area of knowledge and insight. The contribution is the big reminder that practice has to go with understanding. Thanks. And that, just finally, that's the interesting bit about that is that it touches on this debate about well-being in particular. The resilience in the face of the world that we're encountering invites us now to think about working on the self in the context of well-being. So that's my answer to the question.
Okay. I'll just go kind of quickly in reverse order. The central issue to what Lorianne said about the humanitarian, I didn't cover it as much in here, but it's in the paper, is that the valorization of markets is what's happening in the virtual economy. So it says, and I think this goes to the discussion of the social, I mean, I was thinking Minecraft too. Minecraft's a very interesting, where lots of virtual worlds are created. I mean, this was the idea behind both Facebook and Instagram. You create the social world first in the virtual community, then you commoditize it and get your income streams. So of course there are problems with these models and they're falling apart, so they're trying to figure out, okay, let's build up a social community, then let's figure ways to extract income from them. And so you see this in that the thing that is not valorized is not the social worlds that they're creating, it's the markets that come from the social world. So it's a kind of reversal. So when it comes to the humanitarian, this turns humanitarian crises, it turns refugee camps and the lives of women fleeing death into a future stream of income profit for virtual companies that Google wants to get on board with, right? It turns the lives of these women into potential income, right? And so the valorization of markets, and the reason I go after it for that is that's what the World Bank Development Report says. It says that the potential for markets here is good. That's it. Right? It knows, it fully recognizes, all the reports recognize all the problems with gold farming in terms of social costs, in terms of damage for the workers, in terms of all that stuff, but it's an income stream, and more of the income ends up in the developing world, so it's better, right? It's better because it's the sheer crassness of thinking of it in terms of income stream. And so I'm trying to re-embed the notion of where this comes from, where the values and the sociality that they're drawing on in order to develop these income streams. So they can perfectly well create these social worlds, and they can create games that are much more successful without being monetized in order to, that's what the expectation is, the future. That's why the capitalization was so high on Instagram. It's not what they're producing now, it's the future production from this social world. So they create societies in order to say, look, I've got the society, then I can extract the wealth from it. But what I'm saying is, why don't we start from the social world and say, what are the values being created there, and what are the resistances that are going to happen, which happens all the time. I mean, this is the problem with the World of Warcraft. The reason that it's losing gamers is that it's not working in terms of the social world. So to go back to the first question on hiring economists for it, yes, because the virtual markets function like an unencumbered free market. They're crazy. Right? Like they're so manipulated easily by the companies. You had, what happened in World of Warcraft is that there was too much gold farming, so they devalued all the old goods and crafted new goods which were worth different values. And so there's inflation all the time. All of the anti-gold sites are that you're devaluing the goods, you're creating artificial demand, you're undermining demand, you're manipulating our social world through your markets. It's a critique of the market. That happens over and over again, and there isn't a good answer for this. There's all these externalities, and they do this, though. They try to do this, and this is why you can have a Ponzi scheme where they actually said, sorry, you guys all got screwed, but we're not doing anything about it because the market functioned the way it was supposed to, right? So it's not our responsibility if you guys have a virtual market, and it collapses on itself, that's on you. And it's even more so the case in Bitcoin, that Bitcoin depression, because it is not regulated, but for the most extent, not regulated by anybody. So it's a virtual currency that anybody can exchange, that anybody can create with a computer at any time. It's just that it's so hard to create them that they have an artificial scarcity. And what happened is that everybody decided to sell them at the same time, and it collapsed the value of the Bitcoins. But who's responsible for it? And so there's this question now that's hitting the US. Should the US regulate these virtual currencies because they are functioning now as sources of wealth and value that are being depreciated by actions in the virtual world? So yeah, no, I do think, I think I did it better, but I do take the point about the gender, that it is a very gendered space. I mean, it's getting better in certain ways and not in others. But as far as exploiting these these are all potential sources of income for this market-based mentality of development, right? Everything is. If you can conceive of it, you can make money off it.
All right, I think that's the end of time. Thank you very much for 2 great presentations.